What's the opposite of strength? Weakness. Right. Okay, you get the point. I think we all get the point, and we all know this. But I think that sometimes, even as activists, even as queer activists, we fail to see the ways in which these binaries filter the way that we see different binaries when we're talking about justice, victimization, offender, victim, etc. So consider this. Gender binary structures every facet of social life in contemporary settler colonialism, such as Canada. Okay, so we'll take that for granted and say, yes, that's true. Our bathrooms, our kinship structures, the division of labor, our prisons, but also the way in which we think about terms like violence, harm, victim, and offender. The gender binary is both an abstract social belief system and an everyday experience of power that is dictated by our position on it and our ability to conform to gendered norms. Gender nonconformity becomes a risk factor in tumbling farther down socioeconomic hierarchies, rendering us unable to secure work, protect ourselves from violence, feed ourselves, etc. But for right now, let us consider the queer and trans experience to be one that makes a mess of oppositional or dichotomous notions of identity. So let's think about queerness as making a mess. It blurs, combines characteristics from both sides, it shares labor, it hybridizes forms that we tend to think of as opposites. Thus, when we are queer, when we are transgender, we are in many ways actually threatening the whole social order. And I take that as a point of queer pride. So what does this have to do then with prisons? Well, in a basic sense, we know our facilities are separated out according to the gender binary in this really cisgendered way based on anatomy, male, female. But the other pervasive binary that structures our whole criminal justice system is that of the victim, which is considered to be the morally correct position, and that of the offender, which is seen as a moral affront to society. These two positions tend to often be associated with masculinity and femininity, and this is a problem when we start talking about prison advocacy. We know that children considered to be male are taught to accept and use aggression, and they're praised for that in certain ways. So in this way, the gender binary also organizes the positions of victim and offender in our social world, and when we think about how violence is enacted in families and intimate partner relationships. And we have decades of feminist activism and critical thinking to thank for this kind of analysis. However, when we stay in this position, when we stay firmly rooted in dichotomous relationships between victim and offender in our analysis of social violence, I believe that we're actually contributing to the very structures that promote violence against queer people. We are erasing the experiences of gay and lesbian couples who face high rates of domestic violence, for example. And in many cases, as many studies have shown, rates of domestic violence in same-sex partnerships are equally high, and in the case of gay men in marginalized communities, actually higher than that of heterosexual cisgender couples. Prison advocacy for women living in jail tends to focus on women's previous experiences of victimization, and that's what led them to jail. And this is effective in generating empathy for women as offenders because we're quite comfortable about thinking about women in the context of victimhood. But when we stay in a level of comfort in thinking through victimization as associated with feminine traits, we also erase, for example, the fact that sexual assault can and does happen in women's prisons, and of course, in same-sex relationships, including lesbian relationships. So when we think about this kind of messy stuff, it's important when we think about prisons, because if we see prisons as an answer to these kinds of violence, we also have to account for the fact that the incarceration of folks who enact those forms of violence tends to be very gendered. So if we are to understand the factors that render queer people vulnerable within carceral spaces, we must be continually reflexive and aware of the ways in which our notions of victim and offender are connected. When we take up a queer position, when we try and mess with the organization of these concepts, say in restorative or transformative justice practice, we become open to new possibilities for how victims can also be offenders. And we can better account for the complexity of social harms and healing. But hopefully, a queer reimagining of justice can get us out of the carceral trap, which I believe has been a colossal failure in responding to the social problems of violence and poverty. And I think with recidivism rates that hover around 2/3, we can safely say that the prison project is a failure on many counts. So before we turn to the embodied experiences of queer and trans people in prison, I want to draw from a few concepts that will be helpful in thinking through different levels of violence within the prison system. So raise your hand if you've heard the term toxic masculinity. Okay, what does it mean when we say toxic masculinity? What is toxic masculinity?
I guess I've come to understand it as, I've typically heard pathological masculinity,
okay.
Maybe however you want to talk about it, and maybe certain key traits like hyperaggression, or
okay.
actually any of the traits listed on the left that would be taken too far
okay.
In a certain way, or yeah, and I guess it ultimately maybe becomes a question of degree, but yeah.
Okay, so when we talk about toxic masculinity, we're accounting for the ways in which how masculinity is taught in the gender binary can become harmful in some way. So we tend to see this term lately and in recent history deployed in conversations about the lone shooter or the school shooter type of violence. So more recently, the Oregon shooter in October 2015, his manifesto clearly outlined the ways in which misogyny and social alienation came together with tragic consequences. But discussions about toxic masculinity can help us to understand how homophobic and transphobic violence is perpetrated both within and outside of prisons. And I don't like to talk about violence within prisons without talking about how it exists outside. Because I think that thinking about it as connected and part of the spectrum is part of having a queer analysis. So I want to read to you a quote from the book Captive Genders, Trans Embodiment in the Prison Industrial Complex. It's edited by a wonderful activist and researcher, Eric Stanley and Nat Smith. And the excerpt I'm going to read for you is from a chapter written under the pen name Cholo from a currently incarcerated inmate somewhere in the United States. And Cholo writes, "The harm that the prisoners have to endure is usually performed in front of others. They do this in the hopes that these acts will provide the impression that they are not queer and will protect them from attacks by others in prison. These individuals are motivated by fear, and these acts are done in order to survive. Their survival is based on the maltreatment of others." So here, Cholo is giving us a queer reading of transphobic violence in jail. He's pointing out that toxic masculinity requires acts of violence, especially sexual violence, to secure one's safety in the institution. And in the violent and masculinized world of a men's facility, these acts of violence are currency to secure yourself safety from dehumanization. And in this sense, we want to begin to consider men's facilities as deeply implicated in teaching and perpetuating forms of toxic masculinity. They intensify the same structures of violence that exist outside the prison. So one study from Richmond, Virginia, showed that at least half of transgender individuals in that town were sexually abused or assaulted at some point in their life. Other studies have confirmed rates up to 66% of a given trans population in a community. Research from the United States shows us that trans inmates are 10 times more likely to be sexually assaulted in prison, and an incarcerated man, cisgender or not, actually faces astronomically high rates of risk for sexual violence. So prisoners in general face an incredibly high risk. Coupled with being trans, especially in a man's facility, it's a deeply troubling situation. We know that trans women of color face the highest rates of violent victimization. However, despite this, our mainstream idea of what a rape victim looks like is generally a cisgendered woman who has relationships with men in a heterosexual context. In many places in the US and unfortunately in Canada, a trans woman with top surgery could conceivably be housed in a jail with men where she would be forced to be topless or fully naked in shower or recreational facilities. And prison overcrowding. This is a really important point. A lot of prison abolitionists argue against the building or construction of any new facilities because it furthers the prison industrial complex. If we're going to protest building new prisons, we must acknowledge that overcrowding, especially in Canada's north, has been identified both by our correctional investigator, and these statistics take place anywhere there's a jail in the Western world where there's overcrowding. The risk for sexual assault in those facilities skyrockets. The risk for violent assault also goes up, but sexual assault specifically. However, all of this in mind, solid research on sexual violence in Canadian prisons is seriously lacking. The general research consensus is that it's not nearly as common as it is in the United States. And one particular study says, well, there's not a lot of evidence, but available evidence shows it's probably not a problem, right? And this is actually what the research literature is concluding about Canada, and most of this is, 10 to 15 years old. But I know anecdotally from my work in men's facilities that sexual assault has increased as overcrowding has increased. And a lot of the men that end up in those facilities are coming from experiences of sexual violence before they even get there. Conducting research to determine the extent to which sexual assault is actually happening and impacting inmates requires cooperation of federal and provincial correctional agencies, which you can imagine has been incredibly difficult, especially under the last federal government. Federal prisons require research to be approved often at the national level, where researchers face extensive, seemingly bureaucratic delays that delay the research so long it becomes next to impossible to complete. So now I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about placement in inappropriate facilities. So the official policy of the Correctional Service of Canada is to place transgender inmates into facilities based on external genitalia. Provincial policies differ across the country, but anatomy or the status or pronoun on official identification tends to be where bureaucrats and staff take direction. The treatment of trans inmates in federal and provincial facilities has been arbitrary in most cases, and frontline staff and bureaucrats make decisions lacking in education that are often rooted in transphobia. Does anyone know where the most progressive provincial policy is in terms of trans incarceration? Which province has the most progressive?
Ontario.
Yes, exactly. So Ontario has the best policy on trans incarceration, where preoperative or non-binary trans offenders can choose to be housed in facilities that best reflect their gender identity. So you can imagine that that would probably reduce the risk of self-harm and also reduce their risk for sexual assault. Policies that rely on investigation of external genitalia as the deciding factor in the placement of an inmate discriminate against those who are on the trans spectrum but don't want to undergo full transition surgery, and nor should they have to. It also discriminates against those trans people who don't have access to surgeries because, say, they live in New Brunswick, the only province in Canada that doesn't have any kind of funded transgender support in the healthcare system. In all facilities, trans inmates face challenges receiving hormone therapy, where it's often difficult to receive or denied altogether. And what you often see happening is, as I mentioned in terms of research, these bureaucratic delays in making things happen. This is a really Canadian approach to oppression that's profoundly passive-aggressive. But, oh, well, the form wasn't passed to the right person, or we'll have to ask so-and-so, we'll ask so-and-so up the chain of command. So a lot of the frustration that folks are facing in getting hormone therapy is related to this kind of endless passive-aggressive bureaucracy. We must also pay attention to how transphobia and homophobia play out in immigration detention, something we don't talk about enough. The 2014 case of Avery Edison, who was detained over an immigration issue, was misgendered and sent to a men's facility. And this brought public attention to incoherency in Canadian policies. In this particular case, Avery had a UK passport that identified her as female, and she was sent to a men's facility anyway. So perhaps we should tell the state to follow Ontario's lead in staying out of our pants when determining where we will be incarcerated. The forced inspection of genitals and misgendering of trans identities is an act of violence. It's what sociologist Irving Goffman would call a mortification of the self, or a humiliation ritual that functions to erode our power and force our conformity to the gender binary as part of our rehabilitation in the Canadian prison system. So in this way, our prison system is like a factory that seeks to produce and reproduce the gender binary and erode the important work that many traumatized, vulnerable, queer and trans people have accomplished in order to accept who they are and leave their closets behind. Assault and violence within institutions is one way that can